Hello, David.
Hi, how you doing?
Now, you had quite a bit of reaction to your Mail on Sunday piece about the temperature decline after the recent intense El Nino. Did it surprise you?
I'll be honest, I was absolutely astonished. I mean, it seemed to me that this was a piece that was really uncontroversial. No serious scientist doubts that there was a large El Nino. Um, it it was merely pointing out that there had been some somewhat overblown claims made for temperature records in 2015 and 2016, which didn't lay enough weight on El Nino, and also tried to suggest that its contribution was very, very small. In the words of Mr. Scaife, Adam Scaife from the Met Office, he said it was only a few hundredths of a degree. Well, that looks very questionable, and so I pointed out that according to one of the earlier data sets to react, the land-only RSS satellite data, that there had been a very large fall since the El Nino ended. Well, this seems to have aroused the most extraordinary fury. And I've been accused of cherry picking data, of claiming that greenhouse gases have nothing to do with warming of the planet. I've made none of these claims. I've mainly been attacked for things I never said at all. And I do find that really baffling.
It was the cherry picking accusation really annoyed me because it wasn't as though this data set said anything radically different from all the other data sets. If you look at the global data sets, you look at the land data sets, they show the big peak of the El Nino and a decline. It's just that the one used was showed a little bit more of a decline because it's land and because land reacts faster. We all know that.
It's completely baffling. I mean, we're actually going to do a follow-up story this weekend in which we're going to use the HADCRUP4 data set, which, is obviously one of the most authoritative, if not the most authoritative source of surface temperature data from land and sea. And it too now shows a very large drop up to the end of October, the last month for which data are available. HADCRUP4 was dropping like a stone, and there's no reason to think that won't continue. The seas clearly has some way to go in terms of cooling, so we can expect that will continue to drop. As it is, it's over 0.5 of a degree, quite a lot. So, this cherry picking thing, it just makes no sense. It was just as if they had to find something to attack me, and they didn't really care whether the weapons that they used, well, we talk about post-truth and all this. I was being accused of post-truth reporting. Actually, the attacks were what was post-truth because they just weren't grounded in reality.
Yes, all you did really was present the data and say, look, isn't this interesting? Which is, what it's supposed to do.
I mean, I suppose I made some very important people look silly. Gavin Schmidt from NASA, he has been claiming that El Nino was only responsible for a very small fraction of the temperature records. Well, it's somewhat questionable. If you start looking at the baselines he's using to make those claims, it looks as if he's actually trying to minimize the effect of El Nino and emphasize the contribution of long-term warming. But the thing is this. Again and again, I was accused of not accepting that there's a long-term warming trend, and furthermore, that if there is such a trend, and of course there is such a trend, that it's not largely or to a great extent due to greenhouse gas emissions from human beings. Now, nothing in what I wrote questioned either of those two propositions. Nothing that I wrote in any way called into question, the most recent AR5 report of the IPCC. I'm accused of being a climate denier when I'm not denying anything. I just don't get it.
The thing which surprised me is that much of the criticism was very similar. It appears as if they were all cutting and pasting a previous story, using very crude expressions, anonymous bloggers, to provide information on data. And they were rather approaching the story from the wrong end. They were saying that the story of recent variations of the El Nino and records in the past decade or so are not valid because, look, we live in the warmest decade and look at all the warming that's gone on before that. What we're interested in is a little bit more sophisticated than that crude brush. We say, look, there is this period over the past 10 or 15 years when the temperature hasn't increased that very much. And that's why we have had so many years which have been statistically the same temperature. Now, along comes this El Nino, which shoots the temperature right up, record El Nino, and we hear stories about global warming, long-term global warming is taking off. You know, it's now going into the stratosphere. It's going to be terrible now from then on. And they didn't mention the fact that this was the rising side of a temporary phenomena. When that phenomena, the El Nino, starts to decline, and somebody comes along and says, well, actually, it's going down again now, and the temperature is going back to what it was in the 2013s and much earlier than that, they sort of somehow criticize it from the wrong end and say, well, it was all right for us to say that. It's not all right you to say the opposite.
Well, I mean, I think it's worth here remembering some of the things that were said. I think it was in March that The Guardian had a very prominent article saying that there was now a climate emergency because, you know, we were at that point very close to the peak of El Nino. And so it was being suggested that there was an emergency because this spike was so high, as if this was, you know, the reflection of a new trend that was, you know, far quicker than anything we'd seen before. And of course, that's fueled in part by people like Gavin Schmidt. Now, Gavin Schmidt's been very careful, perhaps rather clever, because in some of his statements, he's been quite measured. Now, you know, we can disagree or we can subject to scrutiny, you know, exactly what the contribution of El Nino was and whether he exaggerated or downplayed it. But in some of his statements, for sure, he did accept that El Nino had an impact. But when it came to those hot months in February and March, he was tweeting out, you know, this is it. Wow, amazing records, without any reference to El Nino. And, you know, some journalists were then picking up on that and very prominently suggesting that, you know, this very temporary phenomenon, the absolute peak of El Nino, was the sign of this world, this ridiculous idea of a climate emergency because of one unusually hot month. There was no recognition of this. But, you know, I think it comes down to something else, which is, you know, underlying this clearly is a much more important debate. And it's a debate that is held in the scientific community. And it's the debate on, you know, what is the climate sensitivity to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Is it 1.5 degrees Celsius, the lower end of the IPCC's likely range, or is it 4.5 Celsius, the upper end? Which end of the range it is clearly has an enormous impact on the degree of crisis or otherwise that global warming represents. You know, what is the decadal or century-long likelihood of you know, what is the range of warming that we can expect by 2100, what by 2050, and so on? These are not, you know, to use a phrase that is often bandied about, settled scientific questions. And yet, journalists often behave as if they're completely settled. They tend to focus on the most alarmist scenarios. And then that, in turn, feeds into policy, so that policies which assume a sort of instrumental, rigid relationship between a given level of carbon dioxide at the very top of the IPCC range and, you know, a given level of temperatures, they become enacted in different countries. The United Kingdom being one of the main places where this has happened with the Climate Change Act and other measures, and the cost is ruinous. And, you know, does it actually save the planet? No, of course it doesn't. I mean, as Lisa Helmers pointed out, what it tends to do is export manufacturing jobs to economies where they're building coal-fired power stations with abandon, such as China and India.
Yes, I agree with you, but it seems to me that you're pointing out the data and showing a graph to be countered by a much cruder level of analysis means that actually the journalistic community are not performing a good enough job here. First of all, they're going to very few experts who are loud and prominent and famous, but who are not representative of a much wider body of scientists doing work, and you can see that from peer-reviewed literature. And they're presenting a very crude argument in a very narrow sense to what are the scientific debates that are taking place among scientists. Because what was in that article about with the temperature spike of the El Nino is something that gets discussed all the time at scientific conferences. Yeah. And yet it doesn't get discussed in the mainstream media. They're full of a much cruder form of representation of what's happening to the climate. And it strikes me there is this great mismatch between what you read in the mainstream media, which is broad brushstrokes, and the cutting edge of the science, where the interesting questions are, as shown by that graph. The idea that, we don't accept that we live in the warmest decade of the instrumental era, and that warmth is due to a man-made effect, was never a debate in the first place. And if it was, it's old-fashioned. We're trying to raise current issues, data as it's happening, talk about it sensibly, and you're met with crudity, you're met with broad brushstroke analysis of an argument that was over 10 or 15 years ago.
And you're also met with absolute outright abuse. I mean, I've been called all sorts of things on Twitter this week. A piece of filth is, one of the more printable comments that have appeared on my timeline. Not by anybody who, is engaged in this debate, just someone who's assuming that I'm trying to jeopardize their children or grandchildren's future by reporting that, El Nino is over and there's been a drop. It's just surreal. The timing is interesting because, I've obviously written pieces about climate before, and often they've aroused, controversy. I really didn't expect this one to do that. I didn't see that this was a very controversial article. It seemed to me, it was being somewhat critical of certain individuals who had hyped records without paying enough attention to El Nino and suggesting that they were wrong. But that's not such a big deal, it seemed to me. I think, why such an extreme reaction? I think we have to look at two things. First of all, that my article was picked up by Breitbart, which is, a conservative website, which happens to have been edited by Steve Bannon, who's going to be, policy director or whatever it's called in the White House, very close to Donald Trump, was the chief executive of the Trump campaign. And so clearly a lot of people are, very sensitive to the possibility that the Trump administration that takes office next year may have a very different approach, both to policy and indeed to science funding in this area. So I think there's a sensitivity there. And the second thing is, by drawing attention to El Nino at this juncture, in November when the article appeared, before, the media was cranked up, ready to report 2016, another record year, we spoiled that party. Suddenly, anything which, trumpets yet again another temperature record that doesn't pay due attention to the role of El Nino is going to look very, very stupid. And so I think we, at a point where they really, really wanted certain individuals to declare a record and get it trumpeted from the rooftops, we made it much more difficult for them to enjoy that.
Well, I think so, because we threw some real data into the mix. The criticism is not very scientific. It's very emotional, it's very rude, it's very quick to come. But when you look at it, the science is not well represented in their criticism. And yet this is repeated throughout the blogosphere, throughout the Twitter sphere, this less than scientific approach to knocking this article down. And it shows that we're speaking different languages. And
of course, there's an irony. I'm accused, you're accused, other people who might sort of discuss this in a more calm way. We're accused of having this ideological agenda of being anti-science. Well, there's no ideological agenda here. Who's got the ideological agenda? Is it me pointing out in the Mail on Sunday that that a perfectly respectable data set is showing a large fall that suggests that certain people were downplaying El Nino earlier in the year, or is it the people who accused me of falsely claiming that the climate change was happening and that it was down to greenhouse gases when I never even addressed this issue? It's extraordinary.
You can look into the scientific community and you find all sorts of opinions about data sets and about research. You express those in the mainstream media and people come out of the woodwork and say, that's terrible, that's wrong. So it's your article not only stressed the fact that there's something scientifically going on, but there's something about the nature of the debate which is inherently nasty, unscientific, that is very depressing considering it's such an important topic.
Yeah, and I think as another example of this, I mean, I got vilified, trashed this week, but I mean, look at what happened to Roger Pielke Jr., who is, here's a guy who wrote this article, just appeared a few days ago in the Wall Street Journal, describing this appalling witch hunt. There is no other word. I mean, he was branded a witch or a heretic. For what? For writing what is absolutely mainstream IPCC science. You know, this is a guy who has actually written in a book advocating for a carbon tax, whose views on climate change and global warming are utterly orthodox. You know, Pilke had to be stopped, and he wasn't just facing, you know, some nasty bloggers and a few hostile articles. I mean, he was facing an organized campaign funded by a green billionaire and a well-funded think tank, which was basically coordinating a series of ruthless attacks on him, which had no scientific basis at all, and there was only one goal: to silence him.
And yet, this doesn't happen in other areas of science. You look at biology, the other physical sciences, they are much more tolerant. Not only the scientists, but also the spokespeople for those scientists, the prominent, well-known scientists who act as sort of representatives of that science. They are more tolerant of what they regard as different views, extreme views.
And they also accept that whatever they say is only ever going to be a partial view. You know, that's what we think at the moment. I mean, I was listening to Brian Cox, a famous TV physicist, being interviewed actually on Radio 2 just the other day. And he was talking about how everything he said was provisional, how we never really knew everything. There was always more to find out, and often new data would come up which would actually call into question fundamental theories that had been believed for decades or longer. Well, apparently climate science is different. Apparently there's a set of dogma, just as there are in certain religions. And if you contravene those dogma, even if they happen to be, you know, highly questionable, you are in for a very unpleasant, rough ride.
And it's not as though the questioning of the Earth's response to the influences it's subjected to is questioning the laws of physics. Nobody's questioning the greenhouse effect, the laws of radiation. Nobody's questioning, you know, anything like that. But the Earth's response is complicated, and it's not a straight line. It's not simple. And it seems to me that you and I are writing about things which are not simple. And we've been criticized because it is all so simple, really, if we would stop denying the science.
Yeah.
So I'll take, for instance, people don't realize the fundamental change that's happened in the last 10 years in climate science. 10 years ago, we were told that the temperature signal, the warming effect, was strong, and it was going to go up and up and up in the future, and there was no doubt about it. Now we say, actually, shorter term variations, decadal variations, have masked that upward trend, and we have to wait for these short-term decadal variations to go away, so the trend will be re-established. So we've gone from signal to noise completely 180 degrees different in the last 10 years, which is a product of the fact that we now realize how complicated things are, and they are not simple.
Well, you know, I'm not a scientist. I wouldn't say I'm doing science, but I am trying to the best of my ability to reflect genuine debates within the scientific community and say things which are, you know, reasonable to say on the basis of that science. And I certainly think that, you know, one of the things that's constantly put to me is, oh, how can you write about this? You know, you haven't got a degree in physics, you haven't got a PhD. These very learned people do. Well, yeah, sure they do, and actually, you know, generally speaking, it's not them who launch the most savage attacks. It's people who are actually lay people in a scientific sense, just as I am. But you know, there's this body of people who will just accept, you know, ex cathedra, as it were. These are the pronouncements. These are the dogmas. This is the catechism. And if you question it, then you are, well, a heretic.
When you were putting your article together, did you find it easy to get informed comment from some of the players in the game, as it were?
No. I mean, you know, I sent a detailed email to Gavin Schmidt asking him to comment not only on the drop in temperature since the El Nino peak and its implications, but also about statements he'd made earlier in the year, which said that there was no pause, no hiatus. He said it in very, very firm language. And yet, you know, there on the front page of that day of the NASA website was this new paper which discusses, you know, the hiatus described as such in some detail. And of course, the IPCC discussed the hiatus at length in AR5. So anyway, you know, he didn't reply. And of course, that's his privilege. But then, you know, when I asked him about this, you know, I was told, well, you know, I'm bored. Why should I answer your questions? Well, fair enough. You know, you don't have to. But you know, it's unfortunate when you try to get comment from somebody who you do mention in the story, and then they attack you afterwards. And then when you say, well, I did try and ask you what you did think about this, and then their attitude seems to be, well, you know, you expect me to answer you? It's extraordinary. And indeed, I had people explicitly coming in on his side on Twitter saying, you can't expect someone of the status of Gavin to, you know, answer questions from a mere doltish worm like you. I mean, it's extraordinary. And I also did go to someone in the Met Office, and you know, I think he had a perfectly good excuse. He had a deadline, and he just didn't have time to talk to me. But you know, it is difficult sometimes. You are trying to get a range of opinion, and some people just are not interested in responding. So,
well, let's hope for something better in the future, David.
I have no hope for anything better in this field. I think it's. We mentioned Breitbart earlier, and this Breitbart article, which actually in its conclusions went much beyond what I said. I think part of the reason, as I say, for the attack on me being quite so vitriolic was it was picked up by this particular site. But the Breitbart author James Delingpole said that he thought this was the final 3 years of the climate scam, and you know, soon he'll be able to declare victory in this struggle. I don't think it's going to be like that. I think this is going to be a very vexatious issue for a very long time to come.
And hopefully, never mind about all the opinions, let's stick to the data.
We can try.
We can try. Thank you, David.
Thank you.